We're very fortunate to have a lineup of current and former political leaders with us this morning. So, to begin with the introductions, most of these people need no introductions. Senator John McCain, the senior senator of Arizona, who's been in the Senate since 1986, currently ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, also on the committees for Indian Affairs, Homeland Security, Foreign Relations, author of several pieces of major legislation, has a reputation, as we all know, as the Maverick. In 2008, he was the model of civil politics in the presidential race, and of course, a war hero who has made tremendous sacrifices for his country. Honor to have you with us here today, Senator McCain. Senator Bob Kerrey, all the way on the end. Another U.S. Senator and combat war veteran who served from 1989 to 2001 in the Senate after being governor of Nebraska from 83 to 87. Also a Vietnam War veteran who was injured during his service. Went on to lead the New School in New York, where he doubled the endowment, oversaw major growth, and of course, Senator Kerrey was also a member of the 9/11 Commission. He co-chaired the Concord Coalition, founded by Senator Rudman. Thanks for being with us, Senator Kerrey. Here in the Senate, we have Senator Phil Gramm of Texas, who worked closely with Senator Rudman, representing Texas starting in 1984 in the U.S. Senate, authoring several pieces of legislation, not least of which the Gramm-Rudman Act. As chairman of the Banking Committee, he steered legislation that changed the legislative landscape for the banking, insurance, and securities law industry, and he's now with U.S. Policy Metrics. Thanks for being with us. To my immediate right, Senator Kelly Ayotte, junior senator of New Hampshire, elected in 2010 to replace Senator Judd Gregg, former Attorney General for the state of New Hampshire, served 3 terms appointed by governors of both parties. Thanks for being here this morning. And last but not least, Dr. Alice Rivlin, who is economist, former U.S. cabinet official, expert on the budget. She's been vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, director of the White House Office of Management and Budget, and first director of the Congressional Budget Office. In early 2010, President Obama appointed Dr. Rivlin to his National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, and thanks for being with us. So I'm going to encourage the panel to really talk, disagree, engage, jump on each other. We're going to dispense with opening statements because I think the most interesting thing to hear is going to be how everybody's perspectives interact and hopefully even clash with each other. And I want to begin with the legislative news in this week's session of Congress that was almost drowned in all of the other avalanche of news when the proposal for expanded background checks failed in the Senate. And I don't want to ask about the substance of that vote, but I want to ask about how it sets up Congress to deal with other major pieces of bipartisan legislation coming down the pike. If we were to see a bipartisan proposal on dealing with debts and deficits, let's begin with the 2 sitting senators, Senator McCain, who voted for expanding background checks, Senator Ayotte, who voted against. How does that vote, followed by President Obama's sort of indictment saying shameful day in Washington, does it clear the decks and ease the way for a bipartisan agreement on something else down the road? Does it poison the well, making it more difficult? What impact does it have, if any?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Well, first of all, there was another event that took place last week, and that was the announcement that 8 of us, for many, many hours of meetings, we really got tired of seeing each other, came forward with a proposal for comprehensive immigration reform. I am confident that most Americans and members of Congress believe that the time has come for us to bring 11 million people out of the shadows, secure our borders, make sure that we have E-Verify and monitor people who exit this country as well as enter. I won't go through all the details. So that's an example of what I think we can do, and we responded, I think, to the American people. In case you missed it a couple of weeks ago, there was a poll that was on favorability. It had all kinds of different things they threw in. Members of Congress ranked on favorability just below a colonoscopy.
I think cockroaches too.
and we are aware of that lack of respect and appreciation by the American people, and that favorability is well deserved. And I believe that this president, as all presidents in their second term, is now looking at his legacy. And that's why I've been over to the White House 3 times in the last few weeks. That's why he has encouraged the immigration reform. That's why, even though it was really tokenism, I think some of my friends here would say he did propose in his budget some very small reforms in the social contract and entitlements. So instead of saying that the glass is mostly empty, I'd say there's a little bit in it that, and the president has made an outreach, had dinner with Republican senators, and there's absolutely, I promise you, a different tone coming out of the White House. So I am guardedly optimistic that we can come up with a grand bargain. It has to be a grand bargain in this case because nobody's going to agree to increases in revenues and not reform of entitlements and vice versa. So I am a bit of an eternal optimist and believe that even though there's a distinct partisan flavor to Congress, that we can and must fix a system that is headed for a train wreck. And as David pointed out, we do have some obligation to our children and our grandchildren. So my assessment of the situation is that the environment is more conducive to addressing the issues that David pointed out so graphically than any time since, frankly, Gramm-Rudman. Since Gramm-Rudman, the environment is better than any time since then.
Well, Senator Ayotte, you were at one of these dinners with the president. Do you get the sense that Republicans in Congress have a working partner in the White House? And is a working partner what they need? Is everybody able to compromise and still get reelected when they come up for reelection?
Well, I will say I was in the initial dinner that the president had. Senator McCain was there as well. And that was the first substantive discussion I'd ever had with him. So other than I think when I first got elected, there was sort of a perfunctory call from the president, but I had never had any interaction with him. And so that was, I think, an important, it could be symbolic, but an important outreach to actually have a substantive dinner where we talked about the fiscal state of the country. And so I would agree with Senator McCain. There are several events that are coming together that there's a recognition on both sides of the aisle. This is the central issue of our time. People can have very strong feelings on individual issues, whether it's issues, gun control and how to address violence, other types of issues that people have strong feelings about. But there's no question that there's a recognition, particularly in the United States Senate right now, that the central issue of our time is the fiscal state of the country. And so being part of that dinner was important. I would agree that the events as they are playing out right now in Washington, with the sequester, with the upcoming reaching of the debt ceiling again, that there is a window here of great opportunity for a bipartisan fiscal agreement for the country. And I think this is the central reason why I ran for office. So I am looking forward to an opportunity to be part of that agreement, because ultimately every other issue is going to be controlled by whether we can address the debt, as David Walker talked about this morning. So I do feel encouraged that there is an opportunity here. And I don't think you can take one issue and judge it as this is going to define every other issue. Again, the example of the immigration coming up in the Senate, I think there's a renewed interest and optimism toward addressing the broken immigration system because of the work done by the 8 senators involved. And I'm looking forward to that debate and that discussion and hopefully being able to move something forward to address this problem.
So just to loop back, it briefly sounds as though you both feel that the gun vote neither made it easier nor harder to accomplish something bipartisan on debts and deficits, that they're disconnected. Senator Gramm has something?
Yeah, I want to say something about the gun vote because I think it's a very significant vote. President Reagan or President Carter, I mean, President Reagan or President Clinton could have worked out a compromise on the gun issue in 30 minutes that the NRA would have supported.
So you think it was the delay that really doomed this? You think it was maybe the timing rather than the substance?
No, it was leadership. My point is Reagan or Clinton could have worked out a compromise that would have gotten 95 votes. I think what happened on the gun issue is very important to the future and very discouraging, because I think the president so overplayed the issue. I think that he has created so much hostility that he ended up losing on an issue which could have easily been worked out.
So if
I think he doesn't know how to cut a deal.
So if we accept the premise that the president's failure of leadership is to account for the gun bill's failure, what should the president do differently to ensure the success of a hypothetical bipartisan proposal to deal with debts and deficits?
First of all, what Phil's saying I agree with. It isn't a failure of leadership, it's how you lead. It's not a question of am I going to lead. He was leading on this issue, but he couldn't put a deal together.
So lay out what he should do differently to pass the hypothetical 2013 Budget Control Act. The Budget Control Act was the name of the sequester, which
both
is a
sides,
separate
look,
issue. But
a good deal is a deal where both sides win. Yeah, you can run over people, you can have your way, you can rub their nose in it, but generally only once.
But so imagine that Dan Pfeiffer is on this panel. He says, what do I do?
You can see the answer after the election. If the president had gone out and campaigned and said, vote for me, I'm going to raise $1.8 trillion of new taxes right after I get elected, he wouldn't have won. And what he did was he went after everybody that was against the tax increases, and significant numbers of Americans are, and made every one of them feel like they're jerks, right? There's something wrong with them for not supporting a tax increase. It was the rhetoric that made it difficult to put a deal together. If I start off, let's say you and I are trying to put something together, and I start off by saying, you're an unpatriotic, cowardly jerk, it's unlikely you and I are going to be able to agree on anything.
And a liar.
So in forward-looking
let
terms,
me
Senator McCain.
Let me answer. What you do is what, frankly, probably Bill Clinton, probably President Clinton was better at than any president that I have seen. You call a group of people over to the White House to that Oval Office, and you sit down and you say, okay, here's the problem, here's what we need to do to solve it, here's my view. Now, what's your view? And then you ask your capable staff to sit down and start putting paper together and things together. Then you call them back again. Now, in the case of Clinton, sometimes that'd be till 1 in the morning. He really liked to stay up late. And so, And you go back and forth with various proposals and counter proposals. Every time we have reached agreements over the last how many years, it's been with presidential leadership, with people involved in the debate and discussion, offer, counteroffer, compromise, result. Pete Domenici's been involved in it. All of us here have been involved in that from time to time. And I'm not putting all the blame on President Obama. Don't get me wrong, the environment really is worse than it was before. But that's the way you do it, and it's got to be through direct communications. I don't know of any group of leaders that have been Democrat and Republican that have been called over to the White House to sit down and say, okay, we got to come up with a grand bargain.
I think they might argue that they did that with the grand bargain that the President and Speaker Boehner almost reached. I can remember sitting in the White House many weekends late into the night as these meetings went on and on and on and were ultimately unfruitful. It looks like Dr. Rivlin wants to jump in.
I think this conversation illustrates the problem. We have spent months and months, maybe years, on the blame game. And even this very reasonable group of people right here, the first thing they want to do is say, who's to blame?
Because that was the question.
I'm not going to defend the president, his leadership style and his abilities to get things done. I worked for Bill Clinton, and he was certainly a master at making friends, listening, and cutting deals. But I'm modestly optimistic at the moment, and partly for reasons that have been mentioned. The president has gotten back in the game. He is having dinner. He is calling people up. He is signaling his willingness to cut deals. He may not be as good at it as some other people, but the other thing is the Congress is getting back to work. And that is very, very significant, I think, that we have budget resolutions both in the House and in the Senate, a potential for a conference. It may not happen, but committees in Ways and Means and Finance sitting down and working seriously on legislation, and that's a good thing.
Senator Ayotte, you had something to say?
Just to Senator Gramm and to Senator Kerry's point, it's a very important point because the president has to decide whether it's about a political victory or it's actually about a legislative result. And so ultimately, we have to decide that too. Both parties have to decide that. And what we need is a legislative result, not a political victory. And a political victory may make you feel good, but it doesn't come to a result. To the point of the recent legislation, there were many of opportunities on certain issues that we could have easily agreed on. And so I think that we all have to be in, if he can be in a place where it's not about a political result, more about a legislative opportunity. And I think that's why President Clinton, in many instances, as well as President Reagan, were able to bring people together. They got political victory because they got the result.
I want to note that we also are going to take questions from all of you, but rather than raise your hand and call them out, I think you all have cards, and so if you want to write a question on a card and just hold it up, somebody will sort of gather and collate the cards and bring them to me as we continue the conversation.
Could I just make one additional comment? The greatest example that I think all of us saw was in 1983. Social Security was going bankrupt. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill walked out in the Rose Garden and said, we're going to fix Social Security. They raised taxes, they raised the retirement age, tough decisions were made, but because two of the probably most respected men in the country at that time stood together, we were able to do that. And it's time we reformed it again. They reformed it for 25 years, is that right, David?
They had actuarial balance for 75, but it was out the next year. So this time we got to make sure we do it the right way.
Yeah.
Then consider demographics.
But it held up a long time.
Yeah.
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 So National Journal in 2012 listed the most centrist members of the US Senate by voting record. And the list included, and this is a test to see if you all can figure out what these people have in common: Joe Lieberman, Olympia Snowe, Scott Brown, Ben Nelson, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anybody know what these people all have in common?
They're not there anymore.
They're not in the Senate anymore. And this is a trend that has gone from one election to another. And I wonder what you all think that does to the possibility of bipartisanship in Congress.
Well,
Well,
first of
they're
all,
not only both gone, but they both represented states, in the case of the Republicans you mentioned, that were much more moderate to liberal states than some of the other from others. Kelly Ayotte is more of a centrist than, say, some of the senators from southern states, but she represents a constituency. So I'm not sure always that that grading is necessarily an indicator of whether you are effective in the Senate or not.
Well, apart from effectiveness, do you believe the center has fallen out? Does that make it more difficult to do things? With certain exceptions, such as present company.
Speaking of the budget deficit, which I thought was the topic of the panel, look, there are times when the problem isn't the Congress, the problem is us, those of us who aren't in the Congress, because we make it difficult for the Congress to reach a conclusion. And what Phil and I were talking about, we weren't blaming Obama. I mean, I've got an F voting record with the NRA. I would have voted for the background check. But it made it more difficult because I've got people in Nebraska who don't want gun control of any kind, any shape at all. And the insult then goes to them and makes it more difficult. That's the point that I was making. It made it difficult to get an agreement. And all of a sudden he had public opinion on his side. And with the budget, you don't have public opinion on your side. because you're going to have to do things that are going to be unpopular with everybody. And so I'll begin with a couple things. One is, if you really, as a person, as a citizen, as a non-incumbent citizen, want to understand what this problem is, I urge you to go to YouTube and just type in Johnny Carson lie detector test. And you'll get Johnny Carson in 1982 or 83 at a press conference wired to a lie detector. And what happens is we want to believe the lie. We want to believe that you can fix middle-class entitlements without the middle class having to pay more or take less. You can't. But we want to believe that we really do care about our children and our grandchildren, but if you look at the spending patterns, we're spending money on the past. People like me, we're not spending money on the future. We want to believe something that isn't true. And with great respect to Dave Walker, when we say entitlements, it's statutory entitlements. It's not constitutional entitlement. You're entitled by statute, and you don't have a debate about it. It's a tremendous problem, Ari. The problem isn't the Congress, in my view. The problem is American people. We've begun to believe that we can have everything without having to pay any price for it. And I'm not cynical about it, but I'm deeply worried about it. Democracy doesn't solve long-term problems very well. And I learned this, actually. I blamed Pete Domenici and Sam Nunn. 20 years ago, uncharacteristically, I listened to what another colleague had to say in a colloquy between he and Sam Nunn, and all of a sudden I discovered this middle-class entitlement problem. It's a real budget problem. And neither Romney nor Obama would tell the American people the truth about it, because they're going for 8% of undecided voters who are monstrously uninformed, and they're trying to get them to vote for them. And they're sure as hell not going to run a message that conflicts with people over the age of 65, 80% of whom vote. That's the problem. The problem isn't the Congress. The problem is us.
I should clarify that we've got two panels this morning, and the second one is going to delve more into the structure of a possible solution. The first one is designed to look more at the political challenges to reaching such a solution.
You raised the point about relatively few, quote, moderates in the middle, and they are all unhappy and left the Senate. I don't think anybody served in the Senate more conservative than me. But we got 73 votes for Gramm-Rudman. Ted Kennedy co-sponsored it. And we got that by basically convincing people that there was a problem and letting everybody be part of the process. And not by going back and trying to say, well, we don't work with you because you don't share our objectives. What we did is that Gramm-Rudman was like this bug inside of a crystal, and we kept finding the facet that was pretty to somebody. And Ted Kennedy, the facet that looked like tax increases, Ted Kennedy locked onto. The facet that looked like spending cuts looked beautiful to me. And the result, but the point is that you don't get there by going around calling people liars. I mean, I've never heard a president talk like this president. You know, if some president had said, because I would have voted, basically because a lot of people voted against this gun bill because they just didn't trust the president. But if some president had called me a liar because my arguments he disagreed with, I wouldn't have forgotten it soon. The point is that Warren and I were able to go around not and ask people, support this because you agree with us. Most of them didn't. We asked them to support it because it was a way of forcing a decision, and there was no guarantee that it was going to turn out our way. And I think that's what, it's not that we got to have a Senate full of moderates, it's that we got to have people that are committed to coming up with solutions that a broad base of people can support. And once Warren and I got past 60 votes, why did we keep compromising to get 73? Because we wanted it to last. We knew it was going to be hard. We got 75? All right, well, I forgot the last two guys. I didn't like them. I didn't like them. Oh no, but the point is that if you want something to last, you got to get people on board. And you got to compromise, and you got to quit impugning people's motives. I never impugned anybody's motive. Bob never did.
I impugned yours once.
So let's talk about the present day. Let's talk about the present day analogy of Gramm Rudman, the sequester, which was intended to be a forcing mechanism to get everybody to reach a deal. So far, it's not working out that way. Is sequester ultimately going to be enough of motivation for Congress to do something, or is it just sort of water under the bridge and done? Either of the sitting senators.
I think it's devastating our national security. You don't have to take my word for it. Ask our military uniform leaders. The Commandant of the Marine Corps said that most of his combat units would not be combat ready by the end of this year. When you look at the world today, I would argue that it's probably more dangerous than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Centrifuges are spinning in Tehran, the Syrian situation, you know about North Korea. I won't go through the litany of things that are happening in the world. A lot of it due to a lack of U.S. leadership, but that's another subject. One of the problems that the military leaders are telling me about sequestration is that some of the outstanding young officers, captains, majors, lieutenants, lieutenant commanders, are deciding that they're not going to hang around an outfit where they can't train and they can't operate and they haven't got the equipment or the ability to do what they believe is necessary in order to defend the nation. That's the most important part of sequestration. The good and the best people. Now, mediocre, well, they'll stay. So this sequester, after we exempted everything else, about half of the budget out of sequester, and then you take half of it out of defense, you are talking about draconian effects on national defense. And interestingly to me, there seems to be a deaf ear turned by the Congress. And that is incredibly disturbing to me. So all I can say is that I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what it's going to take. But I would point out the president said during the presidential campaign, won't happen. Don't worry, it won't happen. And obviously it is.
That. It was during the debate.
Obviously it is happening. But if we continue down this path as far as defense is concerned, we're going to face a crisis we have not faced since the 1970s post-Vietnam War. It was the worst vote I have cast since I can remember voting for it. It was a stupid vote, and I regret it. And I admire those people who voted against it.
Senator Ayotte, do you agree that Congress is turning a deaf ear?
I guess I would say this with regard to the sequester. I fully agree with what Senator McCain has said about the impact on our military. Senator Shaheen and I chair the Readiness Subcommittee for the Armed Services Committee, and the testimony, if everyone here could hear the testimony of the impact of sequester, particularly going forward over the 10-year window, we're really going to be in a position where we're hollowing out our forces, and that's unacceptable. But I think the biggest problem...
Could I add one? Director of National Intelligence testified before the Armed Services Committee day before yesterday that sequestration will prevent him from fulfilling his duties as the head of National Intelligence. Remember? Yeah. General Clapper.
And I think the biggest problem, I voted against it, and the reason that I voted against it is because we didn't deal with the fundamental drivers of our debt. And ultimately, if you go back, flash back to the time we took the vote on the Budget Control Act, we knew then what needed to be done. We know now what needs to be done, because sequester only dealt with roughly 40% of federal spending. A whole host of things were exempt. All of the social contract entitlement programs were, except for a 2% cut to providers on Medicare, were off the table. And so ultimately what we left with is a squeeze on one part of spending that keeps squeezing and squeezing on some important things, including the defense of the country, and also you'll see we're starting to see impacts on the FAA and other critical services. And so when you don't take on what we all know needs to be taken on, back then we knew we had to do a debt reduction deal that dealt with the mandatory spending piece, that put those programs on a fiscally responsible path, that dealt with the tax code, and we are here again. So, so ultimately, where we find ourselves right now with the sequester, it will keep squeezing out of a small part of the budget instead of dealing with the fundamental drivers of our debt and putting us on the right path. So the hope is, with that, with the debt ceiling coming out, we knew back then when we voted on it what needs to be done. We still know what needs to be done on both sides of the aisle. So now, hopefully, if any good can come out of what I think was a foolish way to cut spending, that this will drive a national discussion to get the real large deal that we've all known needs to be done. As obviously Alice Rivlin, having been on the Simpson-Bowles Commission, they recommended years ago, which is, of course, Senator Gregg was a leader on as well.
There's a lesson from Gramm Rudman on this sequester thing. We had a sequester under Gramm Rudman right out of the chute, almost 5% of spending. It never happened again. When Gramm Rudman was re-triggered, we adopted budgets that cut spending enough to avoid the sequester. I think the sequester happened because of a gross miscalculation. I think the administration believed that the defense hawks in the Republican Party wouldn't let the sequester go into effect. They thought they were going to get a political win. It didn't happen, and they went into effect. Now, my own opinion is the world's not going to come to an end because of it. But I do not believe now it will happen again, because it won't be the same miscalculation in the future. But since they're making temporary cuts, this sequester is going to come back over and over and over again until there's some permanent changes.
Well, as David Walker explained just a little while ago, the Congress only controls about 1/3 of the federal budget today. So that's all that's up for hacking, I suppose, unless you get some kind of grand bargain. So let's discuss that. In President Obama's budget proposal, he suggested changes to the way that Social Security is calculated that would reduce benefits for some recipients over time. Somebody in the audience asks, given that Americans are living no longer than was calculated at the establishment of the Social Security system, why balance the budget with Social Security, clearly embodying sort of the liberal reaction to President Obama's suggestion of changes to Social Security benefits? Given that conservatives say this is sort of, a token that is not large enough, liberals say, how are you betraying us, this Democratic president, suggesting changes to Social Security without being pressured into that by Republicans?
This illustrates the problem. Look, and the point that I was making earlier, I mean, there has been a significant, one of the biggest changes since Gramm Rudman's Hollies is what's going on externally in campaigns, with Citizens United and increasing capacity to target your base voter. You've already seen Rich Trumka of AFL say, we're going to oppose anybody that supports the president on Social Security. We'll put a primary up against him. And the Tea Party will do the same thing with anybody that supports anything resembling a tax increase. That's a significant change that's occurred since Gramm Rudman Hollins, and made it more difficult for the Congress to reach agreement. So my point is, there's lots that's going on with the American people that makes it harder. I mean, the president's proposal on the CPI is relatively modest against what the trustees of Social Security are saying. In 2012, the trustee report said he had the largest deterioration of Social Security in the history of the program since 1983. So, I'm trying to remember if I heard Secretary Treasurer Geithner, who signed the damn report, talking about that in the presidential campaign. I don't believe he did. Or Secretary of Labor Solis talking about it in the presidential. I don't believe that she did. And they didn't because they know that it could have an adverse impact on the president. The president's response, I think, is appropriate, but it's short of what needs to be done. And demonstrates why it's difficult to get done, not because of the Congress. The Congress is watching the American people. And the American people, the left is saying, oh my God, this is terrible. Social Security is not contributing to the deficit. Why should we do anything? And the conservatives are saying you didn't go far enough.
Well, Dr. Rudman, you had something you wanted to say?
Well, that's absolutely right. I think that it would have been more sensible of the president to pull Social Security out as a whole and say, let's do a comprehensive reform of Social Security, because we do need to do that. And the reason we need to do it is not to balance the budget on the backs of Social Security recipients. It's to guarantee that Social Security will be there for future retirees, and those future retirees are not our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren. They're people already in the labor force. Those of us who are old enough, you remember that we used to say, well, Social Security won't run out of money until the 2030s. Well, that seemed like a long time. But
and we'll have flying cars.
If you think about it, the moment at which the Social Security Trust Fund has to cut benefits is now estimated to be 2033. People who will retire at 67 in 2033 aren't our great-grandchildren. They're 47 years old and they're in the labor force. Right. We need to fix this system for them.
So Dr. Rivlin, you've probably dealt with this on a more microscopic level than anyone else on the panel. Let me ask, do you think that most well-informed people of any political ideology generally agree on what a package of reforms has to look like? Or are there well-informed people of good faith who have deep fundamental differences on what the path is to this destination? I mean, obviously there are differences, but big picture.
I think the answer is both. Most bipartisan groups, all of the bipartisan groups, and I was not only on Simpson-Bowles, my good friend Pete Domenici and I chaired a bipartisan task force with the same assignment. And you get a group of people from different parties in the room, and the arithmetic drives you to the same solution. You have to control the rate of growth of the social insurance programs, and you have to have some more revenue from a reformed tax system. Which I think that is where you come out. Now, there are people on either end who don't agree with that, who think we should have a much higher level of taxation to finance more generous entitlement programs, or we should cut government services, including defense, drastically. There are a few such people, but there aren't many. The preponderance of bipartisan groups that look at this, and you have to compromise. You have to say, well, we'd rather do this, or we'd rather do that, but you got to put together a compromise. And the compromises really all look the same. They focus on those two big things: the growth of the entitlement programs and the bad tax code that we have that doesn't raise as much revenue as it could if it were fairer, simpler, and we weren't doing as much spending in the tax code.
I've heard everyone talk about rewriting the tax code. Everyone from President Obama to Paul Ryan. Why has there been apparently zero movement on it? Does it have to do with the individuals, corporations, and other interests that benefit from the existing loopholes in the tax code?
Yes.
Who would like to take that? Yes, Dr. Rivlin. Okay, next question.
Well, I want to go back. I'm going to answer the tax question, but let me just go back to the point you raised about public opinion polls. I think this whole public opinion thing is overplayed. In the Reagan budget, we eliminated 3 Social Security benefits, just killed them on one day. The adult benefit, the minimum benefit, the minimum benefit, the death benefit, and the adult student benefit, we killed them on one day. If you had gone and done a poll, 97% of the people would have been against it. But within 6 months, it was the most popular program in 50 years in America because it took dramatic action. So I think if you're going to govern by political opinion polls, you're going to get nowhere. I think people will follow. On the tax thing, the problem is people are talking about tax reform, but they mean very, very different things by tax reform. When Republicans are talking about eliminating special benefits, they're talking about all these subsidies in the tax code, and they're talking about lowering rates. When the president's talking about cleaning the code up, he's talking about forcing small business under C Corp. He's talking about forcing LLCs under C Corp. And he's talking about reducing rates, but a lot of the money going to tax increases. So it sounds like they're talking about the same thing, but it's way apart. And as a result, it's going to be very difficult. And again, that's why the vote on the guns is so important, is that where there isn't trust, it's very difficult to put one of these deals together.
Well,
very
Senator
difficult.
McCain, as somebody with a lifetime of experience putting difficult bipartisan deals together, given that everybody believes the tax code needs to be rewritten, and given the enormous differences that Senator Gramm just described, do you think there is any common ground where everybody can come together and say, these are the principles we can all agree to in rewriting the tax code?
Well, first of all, in the polls, the question is as Phil pointed out, do the decisions drive the polls, or do the polls drive the decisions? And unfortunately, the latter is the case in a lot of instances. There was a famous French revolutionary named Marat who said, "Show me where my people are going so I can get out in front and lead them." And that seems to be the way we do business to some degree in Washington. Yes, it has to be a grand bargain. Phil pointed out the difference in perspective. But I take a little exception to my Republican friends. I think there are some of these subsidies that Phil referred to that are so outrageous they should have been done away with 20 years ago. There's a few families that control the sugar production in this country. And every time you buy a candy bar, you pay more because of sugar subsidies. Why in the world should we have to wait for a grand bargain when we have these outrageous, ethanol has been one of my pet peeves for one of the reasons why I did so well in the Iowa caucus was, and there's the grand bargain part of this, but there's also, why don't we have the guts to just do away with some of this junk that has filled up the tax code years because of who? Special interests.
Well, that may be a rhetorical
Special
question,
interests.
but why not?
That's why the tax code is this high, and if anyone here understands the tax code, please raise your hand. I'd like to meet you. No one does. No one. And so there's two ways of doing this. One is a grand bargain, but the other is maybe a look at some of these most egregious and outrageous parts of the tax code that favor a handful of people, and one of them, by the way, is the farm bill. The farm subsidies are outrageous. You pay people not to farm. You pay them when it rains. You pay them when it doesn't rain. And
as part of the fiscal cliff deal, there was an effort to fix those problems. It failed.
Yes, but which probably means that we're going to have a grand bargain. There are some things that will be very controversial. How much money should you be able to give to charity and deduct it all from your taxes? How many homes do you have to own before you stop getting the home loan mortgage write-off? How expensive should the home be? There's some real issues out there if you really want to get to reforming the tax code that I don't think there's consensus on yet, to tell you the truth.
We have a good question here from the audience. It says, it's notable and probably no accident that the members of this panel are present and past members of the Senate and the executive branch. There are no House members. If we assume that a grand bargain can be passed in the Senate, is there any hope for passage given the toxic atmosphere in the House? I would add to that one of my favorite statistics from Nate Silver, the election statistics guru of the New York Times, who wrote that 20 years ago, there were 100-some swing districts in the House of Representatives. Today, there are 30-some swing districts, and the number of landslide districts has more than doubled. So people are no longer afraid of being defeated by a member of the opposite party in a general election. They're afraid of being defeated by a more extreme member of their own party in a primary. So what does that mean for the prospects of a grand bargain? Senator Ayotte.
Can I just say that I think that, first of all, just a comment on where we are with the fiscal deal and hopefully the ability to move forward with it. It will start in the Senate. And frankly, it's going to start, I believe, outside of sort of the named leadership with people like Senator McCain, who understand how to bring people together and to get a big part of the conference. And that's the key to a fiscal agreement, what Phil Gramm said earlier. He basically talking about we need to get an agreement that doesn't just pass by 51 votes or 55 votes. We need an agreement where we get at least a half of the Republican conference and a big chunk of the Democratic conference, maybe an equal amount of both sides, so that it is a not just sort of a marginal vote over the line, so that when we bring it over to the House of Representatives, that the Republicans in the House know there's a whole host of Republicans in the Senate that voted for it. And so in the same sense that it's bipartisan for the Democrats in the House. So that is the way we're going to have to do this to try to get at least, it can't be a marginal thing where we just push it over the line barely. And I think that for any major issue, if we're going to get it through the House of Representatives. But here's an important point. You know, the Speaker of the House, I very much think that his heart is he wants to have an agreement to get this country on the right fiscal path. And I think that he is a leader who will, if it is an agreement where both sides equally have given, and it's the right thing for the nation, and we've got a good group of Republicans that have voted for it in the Senate, I do have confidence that this is a very important issue to the Speaker.
Would that mean losing his gavel?
I don't
know.
No. I think
Nothing succeeds like success.
How significant is it that he did away with the Hastert rule, which was this rule from Speaker Denny Hastert that said in order for something to come up for a vote in the House, it has to have a majority of the majority. And a couple of times this year, Speaker Boehner brought things up for a vote. Sandy relief, the fiscal deal in early January, in violation of the Hastert rule. They passed with a combination of Democrats and Republicans and not a majority of the Republicans. Is that a significant breakthrough?
Denny Hastert's a wonderful, nice guy. He will not go down in history as the greatest Speaker of the House of Representatives. John Boehner is playing the hand that he's dealt. And that means that sometimes he has to rely on a number of Democrat votes in order to succeed. And I think he has as his goal what he believes is best for the country.
I think I never met a member of the House that wasn't willing to look at something if it really changed the country. I think we're in one of these situations where a little half-baked deal can't pass.
right.
But a dramatic action where you could say to a member of Congress, if you vote for this, you're not going to have to vote on this issue again for the rest of your career. I think you could do it. People will cast a tough vote if they think they're changing America. And again, I go back to the Reagan budget. It was a tough vote, especially on reconciliation, passed by only 2 votes in the House. People did it because
that was a long vote, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a very long vote. And one guy, a guy named Sam Hall, cast the deciding vote. And, but anyway, and he voted right, by the way. But the point is, people thought they were doing something that was important to the country. They thought it was a historic vote, and when people think it's about history, it's a completely different standard. That's what we're missing. This can't be some little old crappy half-baked deal that's not going to change anything. It's got to be something where your grandchildren are going to be talking about it.
Senator Kerrey, you're shaking your head.
Well, I'm skeptical. I mean, in '83, the Social Security fund was depleted. They couldn't write checks. We're talking about a long-term problem. That's only 18 years. 18 years. We're going to go from, let me put it this way. We're all talking about college debt. The average college debt upon graduation from undergraduate is about $23,000. That's total. When they go into the workforce, they're going to be paying $15,000 per person for the rest of their lives to cover whether it's entitlements or social insurance, and that's going to go to $25,000 over the next 18 years. But we're not having a conversation about it, and it may be the last time they vote on this grand bargain, but it may be because their political career ends at the next election. because they've gotten elected. There are significant numbers of people who campaign and promise never to vote for a tax increase. And it may be that they're few and far between on bipartisan commissions, but they're not few and far between out there in the country. I will not vote for anybody that votes for a tax increase. And the person promises never to vote for a tax increase. In other districts, I will never vote for somebody who votes to cut Social Security. And the person makes a promise never to vote to cut Social Security or charge Medicare Part B beneficiaries anymore. They make that promise. And my guess is it's pretty close to a majority in the House that have made that kind of a promise. So I'm generally skeptical that democracy can solve long-term problems. The '83 Social Security problem wasn't a long-term problem. They got to a point where they couldn't write checks. So that's not the problem today. But we're talking about something that's going to happen 20 years from now. And there was a great, I don't know who it was that coined the expression that said there's two kinds of people in Washington, D.C., those who can count and those who lose. And they're counting what that vote's going to do to them at the next election.
Dr. Rivlin, you wanted to jump in?
Well, I was just going to remind Senator Kerrey that he cast a courageous vote in 1993 for the Clinton budget, which wasn't popular. And it did succeed in getting us to a surplus after more interaction with the Republican Congress. But that was a democracy too, and we did solve a problem pretty well.
Okay, so I have a provocative question for the Democrats on the panel. Do Democrats in Washington today care about the debt? Is it a high priority for them? Or are Republicans just sort of pressuring them to deal with it?
The answer is no.
Well, I know how Republicans would answer that question. The question is for the Democrats on the panel.
They do, they're keeping it to themselves.
What would the two of you say?
I would say some do and some don't. One of my personal heroes is Senator Dick Durbin, who has not only proposed, not only did he vote for Simpson Bowles, as did some courageous Republicans, Tom Coburn, Judd Gregg, and Mike Crapo, but he has proposed a Social Security Commission to act quickly in the manner of 1983, and he knows that's going to involve cuts in benefits. So I think there are plenty of courageous Democrats. There just may not be quite enough.
Senator Kerrey, if Democrats had a supermajority in the Senate and an overwhelming majority in the House, do you think President Obama or any Democrats in Washington would be talking about debts and deficits?
Well, I think it would, but the preponderance of taxes used to solve the problem. I think that's sort of the general tendency of Democratic voters. I'm not talking about Democratic congressmen. I'm talking about the voters who send that Democrat to Congress. And yeah, I would say that it's not an exaggeration. It's a reality in the field. It's a reality of Democrat and Republican voters. There are lots of Republicans today, on John's very important point and Kelly's very important point about the risk to defense right now. There's a significant number, and maybe close to a majority in the House, of liberals who are unconcerned about the cuts in defense, and Tea Party members of the House who are unconcerned about those cuts in defense as well. There's a sort of a unity of purpose that I think is potentially very negative. But yeah, I would say, generally speaking, a supermajority of Democrats would not necessarily be good, certainly for the economy. It might solve the problem, but I don't think it would be good for the economy. To Alice's point, I mean, among the things that I think could begin to build a bipartisan coalition is to take those instances where Republicans and Democrats agree and try to build out from it. And you've got Coburn and Durbin supporting a very specific piece of legislation. Not, as Phil was saying, generally I'm for tax reform. You pull back the covers and you see there's lots of disagreement underneath those covers. In this particular case, you have a Republican and Democrat who are supporting something specific, something extremely controversial to get them in trouble the next time they face the voters. So I think it's a terrific example of a way, back to the gun control debate that we had at the start, a terrific example of how it's possible to build out a bipartisan coalition right from the beginning. Because if you don't, if it's a Republican proposal and you go out and look for a Democrat to vote for it, or vice versa, it's a bad way to do business.
We haven't yet talked about the context of this debate, which is an economy that is slowly recovering from the worst recession in modern history. President Obama accuses Republicans of proposing cuts that would slow the recovery further. Is that a real concern, and how much does the current fragile economic state have to factor into the conversations about some kind of debt deficit reducing, tax reforming grand bargain? Who would like to take that?
I don't mind taking it.
All right, go for it, Senator Gramm.
Well, first of all, it's pretty hard to argue with a straight face that we don't have enough fiscal stimulus when we're running $1 trillion deficit. I mean, obviously the president believes that growth comes from government investment. I see no empirical evidence ever in the history of mankind that that is true.
Alice Rivlin?
Correct me if
Senator
I'm wrong,
Gramm and
but-
I are both economists, so you're going to get the big illustration here of economists don't always agree. I think it is important not to do too much austerity right now. That's one of the reasons I'm against the sequester. I think it's dumb policy at the wrong moment for a lot of reasons, but one of them is it will cut jobs. But we need to do two things at once. We need to grow the economy in the near term, and we need to, for reasons of long-term growth, get our hands around this rising debt. We can't have the debt rising faster than the GDP. We've talked about that, and I think everybody agrees on it. But that doesn't mean we need immediate austerity. In fact, you can't do immediate austerity if the things you're doing it with are reforming entitlements. That takes a while. Reforming the tax code, you don't phase that in fast, you phase it in slowly. But you need to enact it soon.
This is why Harry Truman's famous comment that he wanted a one-armed economist, because they always say on the one hand and on the other hand. What you just saw, an example.
Senator Ayotte, did you have?
I would just say, you know, there's no doubt we need to grow our economy. I mean, our economic growth numbers are not where they need to be. And that's another significant way. Obviously, when President Clinton was in office, how we were able to get out of debt is we were able to grow. And one issue that we could spend another whole panel on is the competitiveness of this country vis-a-vis the regulatory climate in Washington that we create on a regular basis in every front. In addition, also, the tax code issue really does drive where Washington has chosen in all these instances, whether it's the sugar subsidies or some other issue, to decide where the economic benefits will go. We have really, in many ways, disadvantages a lot of our businesses. So ultimately, the tax discussion has to be focused on economic growth in the large grand deal, because we cannot come out with a tax code at the end of it that will actually hurt the economic growth piece of it.
Let me give you a little good news.
Please.
This natural gas resources that we are now exploiting is going to have a dramatic and positive effect on America's economy. We will, if we do it right, eliminate our dependence on foreign oil. You imagine how that changes the dynamics of the world and where our priorities are and where our strategic interests lie. Manufacturing technology is developing in such a way that the good news is that the advances are incredibly remarkable. The bad news is they are much less labor intensive. So we have this endemic problem of low-skilled workers that there just is not, even though our economy rebounds, we just don't have places for low-skilled workers, which was obviously an argument for education. And so with an energy-independent nation, with technology advances in the most important part of the world's economy, I'm talking about Silicon Valley, and these devices and the dramatic advances we will continue to see. If Congress doesn't, if we do some of the right things, I am very bullish on the future of the American economy.
We have a question from the audience that says, what bothers me is not the partisan flavor in DC, but rather the control of lobbyists who seem to lay the table and control the menu. This ties right into what Senator McCain was saying earlier. Would you agree that campaign finance reform is a prerequisite to deficit reduction? Phrased another way, I would say, is deficit reduction possible with the system we have, or do we need to get a new system before we can fix the debt and deficit?
I don't think that the two are necessarily connected, but I guarantee you this, there will be major scandals in American campaigns. There's too much money coming into these campaigns. Nobody knows where they came from. Nobody knows who's doing it, and it is distorting the entire political process. I know that maybe my friends here don't agree with it, but it's the worst decision, in my view, of the United States Supreme Court in recent history to treat a corporation the same way as an individual flies in the face of I don't know how many years of legal jurisprudence.
And yet you still believe that a grand bargain is possible, given...
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. I don't think that's
What the money has done is it corrupts campaigns. At least the American people ought to know where the money came from. We don't even do that now. We don't even know where the money came from, much less the unchecked amounts of it. I think some of my Republican friends should have a little buyer's remorse who gave hundreds of thousands or even tens of millions of dollars, and the result we got was certainly not worth the investment.
Senator Ayotte, you were just saying that it seems to make no difference, or at least not a...
I don't think that's going to prevent, and certainly if we're waiting for the campaign finance reform, then we're in trouble. We need to move on the debt now. We need to move on the deficit right now, and we have a window of opportunity, I think, in the next few months to do that with some of the events that are coming up. So, and then you get to a point where you start to get into the midterm elections too intensely. So that's why I say I think this window is now, in the next few months.
You've mentioned a couple times the debt ceiling. I'm just curious, do you see that as sort of like the end date by which this has to be done? Is that the motivating factor in the way that the sequester was before and the fiscal cliff was before that?
You know, I wish that we didn't need certain factors to motivate Congress, but I think the reality is that triggering factors that require decision making is what will drive decisions. And so therefore, for Republicans in thinking about raising the debt ceiling, it's very important, I think, for the House of Representatives, for Republicans in the Senate, that we do something about the fiscal state of the country. And so I think that's sort of a driving event that will force a discussion. And I think that the administration appreciates that as well. And then the overlap of that is the sequester, as people see more of the consequences of that. I think those two things, and then the discussions that are being had, all of them coming together, is why I see this as a potential window of opportunity to really get the country on the right fiscal path. And I will say that what Senator Gramm said is absolutely true. We can't do some little Mickey Mouse thing around the edges. We should do something big.
But could I just say that I think the American people in Congress are tired of these cliffs. And I think we found out through history that when it's a showdown between the president and the Congress, the president wins. And we Republicans have to understand that the four showdowns, when on the debt ceiling or whichever cliff it happens to be, is not productive for it. We look at the approval rating of Congress, as I mentioned, it's bad. When you see these fights begin, it's just the way the American people are, they side with the president.
And I also think that this isn't an opportunity for a fight. The president should seize this moment. It's coming up. The presidential leadership is critical on it. Start it now, get the right group of people together, and drive the discussion.
So I feel like on the first debt ceiling debate, I guess it was a year ago, the president tried sort of leading the bipartisan troops himself in White House meetings. Feeling that was ultimately unsuccessful. The next time around with the fiscal cliff, he said, you guys take care of that. Pretty much unsuccessful. On the sequester, it strikes me that he sort of just threw up his hands and said, well, screw it. And so the sequester happened.
Remember, sequester was his idea.
Sure. The next big thing, the fiscal, the debt ceiling again, having tried all three of these tactics and all three of them having been unsuccessful, how does he get everybody to a grand bargain the fourth time when the first three times there was no success?
Fatigue.
Fatigue.
I'd say bargain.
So go back to the
Something
first
he didn't try
tactic.
the first 3 times.
Well, he and Boehner were very close to a deal. I mean, he did try bargaining at the White
Depends on
House.
whose story
No.
you listen to.
Yeah, you're saying no. I mean, I understand there were these moving goalposts accusations. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds.
Look, Ari, I'll repeat what I said. There are things where Republicans and Democrats have already agreed on controversial items. And use that vehicle. Use the Social Security proposal that Tom Coburn and Dick Durbin support. They both have endorsed it. Take something where Republicans in Congress have already agreed on something that's difficult and use that as a foundation to build it out. Because I don't think the regular order is going to get the job done. And I, by the way, do think that significant political reform is necessary, including campaign finance reform, but you're not going to be able to wait for that.
Although one of the biggest complaints I've heard from members of Congress who are frustrated with the way it's run now is that regular order no longer exists.
Well, but again, I'll repeat it for a third time. There are things where Republicans and Democrats have already agreed. Well, on Social Security they have.
That was not much from Senator Domenici in the front row.
It doesn't take much. It doesn't take much. If you've got a group, even a small group, I would say begin with it. Why the heck not try it? Try something other than what's been made. But why repeat the same thing over and over and over, expecting a different outcome?
Dr. Rivlin?
I just wondered what the members of the Senate, past and present, think would happen if the president came out strong, said we need a grand bargain, I'm going to invite you all up to Camp David or Andrews Air Force Base or someplace, and we're just going to stay there until we hammer it out. He's got to have the right people in the room, but if he charged ahead with that kind of tactic, could it work?
Senator Ayotte, you're nodding your head yes.
I don't think so. I think you got to lay the groundwork first. First,
Yeah.
you got to have the outlines of the bargain.
Yes.
You can't just say, "Okay, everybody get together, kumbaya." You got to have the outlines of an agreement, and then get everybody else on board.
But I think, though, to Dr. Rivlin's point, with the groundwork there, he has to come out very affirmatively for the bipartisan deal as a top priority of his that is willing, that he's willing to give and we're willing to give, but so that the political climate is there to really get it to an agreement that can get over the finish line.
Contextually, does Congress have the bandwidth to deal with immigration and something as big as this and whatever else might come up all at the same time? Yes?
Yeah, we're going to
The
go
more
through
big things you do, the easier they are.
Yeah.
Really?
That's true, and immigration reform will go through judiciary, and then it'll go to the floor. It's already on the track. Now you can basically, I hope, start focusing on the issue we're discussing.
Senator Kerrey? You look like
Well,
you were trying to jump in.
I'll beat my drum one more time. I don't think you would have difficulty finding something where Republicans and Democrats agreed, perhaps on a losing side of debate. I mean, just take John's earlier suggestion of sugar and ethanol and crop insurance. I believe, John, there were Democrats on the crop insurance piece that were with you on that. So why not use something like that from a distance everybody knows needs to be done, and use it as a confidence builder to build out a bipartisan foundation? To use it as a way to make the case that Republicans and Democrats can agree, that they have agreed. They've just been on the minority when the vote occurs.
We have something from the audience. None of you have mentioned the burgeoning cost of medical care, which probably will become an even greater driver of the deficit. Dr. Rivlin, how does the cost of medical care, how do health costs fit into the equation?
Oh, health care is crucial to the whole thing. When we were talking about the fact that the three big social insurance programs drive the budget, we meant mainly Medicare and Medicaid. Those are the programs which, for two reasons, drive federal spending up in all projections faster than the economy can grow. And that's the combination of the demographics, which are huge. We will have nearly twice as many beneficiaries of Medicare in 20 years as we have now. That's a lot of people. But it also is because healthcare costs have been rising per patient, per capita, per anything, faster than other spending. So you multiply those two things together, and that's the basic cause of the problem. There's a lot of good work going on, I think, at the moment on how to reduce the rate of growth of healthcare costs. And the Bipartisan Policy Center, where I've worked, has a report out this week, which emphasizes moving away from fee-for-service medicine, which rewards the volume of services, and more toward paying for outcomes and improved health and value. That's a hard thing to do. It'll take time, but I think there's a growing bipartisan consensus that we have to do that kind of thing.
Could I offer one figure, just so a figure that doesn't get enough play, that your average family pays in $119,000 over a lifetime to Medicare and takes out $357,000. So if you just put that number in perspective, that number in itself shows that you can't get there with the demographics.
Now, isn't anybody who votes for a package that includes changes to that going to be attacked on the campaign as somebody who put America's seniors on the chopping block?
Depends on whether it's consensus or not between Republicans and Democrats. Go back to Reagan and O'Neill.
Well, the last campaign, I think, was encouraging in that both the president had cut Medicare to fund health care, his health care program. Republicans had adopted a dramatic change in Medicare in the House. That didn't turn out to be the determining issue of the campaign.
There were a lot of attacks on those
Here's a problem in Medicare. When the president's talking about reforming Medicare to save money, he's talking about having government play a larger role in deciding how resources are allocated, how people consume health care, and how providers are compensated, okay? Republicans are talking about providing incentives for people to be cost conscious and incentives for the provider to be responsive to those concerns. The problem is they're the two polar opposites. If you're going to have everybody have access to health care, you're either going to have a system whereby they ration their use the way we do in every other area of the marketplace, or the government's going to have to do it, one of the two. But the difference between the two approaches are worlds apart. So while it sounds like President Obama is for reforming Medicare, Republicans are for reforming Medicare, they are further apart in that area than almost any other area.
Dr. Rivlin?
I don't think they're that far apart because I think you can do both. You can change the incentives in Medicare so that providers are rewarded for producing health rather than producing more services. That's one line of attack. And you can make the Medicare system, especially Medicare Advantage, which is already a competition among private plans, you can make it more competitive, have it competitively bid. I think you can do a whole bunch of reforms that Senator Gramm would like in Medicare Advantage and see if you can't get competition working for you to reduce the rate of growth of cost.
Look, I think the answer to your question is emphatically yes. Even if it looks like it's going to be adverse to people over the age of 65, that issue will be used in campaigns to the disadvantage of anybody who votes to make it look. I mean, Pete was there in '86 when Bob Dole got the Senate to vote, and I think President Reagan supported it before it got to the House to freeze the COLA for a single year. And as I recall, it didn't have any impact at all, except the Senate went Democratic in the '86 election. So the answer, I think the answer is emphatically yes. If you could get Republican Democrats, the way John suggested, to hold together and attack people who were attacking them for the vote, it's possible. But you can't get everybody to agree to it. That's the great fear. The great fear is anything that looks like it's going to cost people over the age of 65 more, or they're going to have to take less, is a deathly vote. It's an extremely difficult vote. It's a source of my skepticism that anything is going to get done in the short term.
Okay, so I pressed the Democrats on whether you actually care about debts and deficits. I want to press the Republicans now. Since the fiscal cliff deal, Speaker Boehner and Senator McConnell have said, we're done talking about revenues. We did revenues in the cliff deal. No more revenues, no more revenues, no more revenues. Are revenues off the table?
I think what you're hearing is a great frustration from Republicans that the $600 billion of new revenue that came from the fiscal cliff, that there's, this wasn't part of, any kind of entitlement reform or anything that would drive forward the, the fiscal, ultimately the fiscal agreement. Do I think that revenues are fully off the table? I think that if there is meaningful entitlement reform or social insurance reform or however you want to call this, that no, because the issue is, but there's no way you're going to get Republicans to do a grand bargain without real reforms that are going to put us on the right fiscal path. It's just not going to happen. They're not going to. They felt, with the way, the president just beat them down on the last campaign on this issue, that there would have to be something very meaningful. So if there's something meaningful that puts us on a right fiscal path, a big deal that's real, then no. And I think, and also it's the context of how it's done. It has to be done focused on making sure that economic growth is key to it. But I think both sides should be focused on that, because the biggest source we're going to get from revenue is obviously getting our economy moving regardless of what we do.
Senator McCain, do you agree with that?
Yes, and I'd just like to point out, if you paid attention to David Walker's presentation, it isn't that we aren't taxing people enough. It's we're spending too much. And you have an endless cycle of over $1 trillion debt laying on our kids and our grandkids and if you're young enough, on yourself, then that's not the problem. The problem is spending. And unless there is a real ironclad absolute commitment to reducing spending, and the only way you're going to do that is by reforming the, quote, entitlement programs, then Republicans shouldn't go along. Right. But are we absolutely taking it off the table? No, but we just did raise taxes. We just did raise your taxes. How's that working out for the debt? Right. So the problem is the spending, and if our friends on the other side of the aisle will acknowledge that that's the problem, we're not going to tax our way out of this problem unless we want to end up like Greece. And I tell my friends, and there's a lot of seniors that live in Arizona, God bless them, that at the town hall meetings, in Greece, when the Greek economy collapsed, the first thing that went was their social safety net. That's the first thing that went. So, because they couldn't afford it. So my point is not so much this, well, will you do revenues, or will you do or will you do spending? Spending is the problem. Will we take everything to do with revenues off the table? No, but we want our friends on the other side of the aisle to acknowledge that that's not the problem. And it makes me angry when we see, I can't tell you the thousands of times, won't you be willing to raise taxes, right, Senator McCain? Won't you be willing to raise taxes? Won't we understand what we're doing to America that was so graphically demonstrated by David Walker? Let's address the problem. The problem is spending and out of control entitlement.
Well, I would also add, by the way, I think Judd Gregg had a great op-ed recently in The Hill, where there's this great love of looking back to where we go back to the Clinton era. Well, we are now above Clinton era tax rate for high individual incomes.
Could I also point out in the Clinton era, we had a wonderful thing, and I'm not taking anything away from President Clinton, and that was called a peace dividend. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were able to free up literally over time hundreds of billions of dollars because we didn't have to spend it on in the Cold War.
Senator Gramm looked like you wanted to jump in.
The tax debate is not about the deficit. The deficit is being driven by entitlements, and there's no way you can tax your way out of it. The tax debate is about funding a big government. And what the president is basically saying is, for me to consider reforming entitlements, I want the tax increases that will guarantee that we can have a big government in America. That's what the debate's about. It's not about taxing to deal with the deficit problem. It's about taxing to keep government up as a percentage of GDP. The president got a slam dunk political victory on the fiscal cliff tax increase because he held a winning hand. He could have negotiated that out, and it could have been a bipartisan thing, and it could have been a good confidence builder, but that's not the way he played it. Now, the reality is that when we were writing that tax cut, we desperately tried to get 60 votes so we could make it permanent. And if the Democrats had offered us what the president won as a victory, we would have signed on to it in a heartbeat. I mean, it was hardly a win, but it played as a political victory. And so again, it helped the president, he won, but in terms of governing, it hurt the president and it hurt the country.
I know before we wrap up, Dr. Rivlin and Senator Kerrey both want to jump in. So, Dr. Rivlin?
I wanted to propose a compromise formulation. I think we could all agree that social insurance or entitlement spending is driving the deficit in the future, and that we can't tax our way out of this problem. But I would also offer the second proposition that we can't finance the retirement and health care of twice as many seniors, nearly twice as many seniors, at the tax rates that we had, or the tax as a percent of GDP that we had before those seniors arrived on the scene. So we're going to have to recognize that there is spending in the tax code as well as real spending, and that's got to be part of the solution.
And Senator Kerrey?
But, I mean, I agree with that proposition. I mean, it's an 18-year process, starting from right now. Almost 20 million more Medicare and Social Security beneficiaries are going to come on the roll. It's a big number. And the average cost is about $40,000 per person, so it's a big number. You got to finance it somehow, regardless of how you reform the system. Look, in 1990, George Herbert Walker Bush ended his political career by supporting a budget that had a tax increase in it. I voted for that budget. I voted for the 93. I voted for the 97 balanced budget. And every single time there was opposition. And the best expression of that opposition was actually Alan Simpson, who says after voting for 90, he goes back to Cody, Wyoming. And this is where I began. We are the problem in lots of ways. He goes back to Cody, Wyoming. A man walks up on the street to him and says, Senator Simpson, I have always supported you. I've always liked you. My family and I have always supported you every single election, but after that budget vote, he said, I wouldn't vote for you again if you were Jesus Christ. And Simpson said, I looked down on him and I said, buddy, if I was Jesus Christ, I wouldn't be representing Wyoming. It isn't, the point of the story is it's not going to be possible. It's not going to be possible to get this done without somebody saying, I'll never vote for you again. It's not going to be possible for this to get done without people like Senator McCain and Senator Ayotte saying, I'm willing to do the right thing even if you don't vote for me again. There is no easy choice here. The easy choices are long gone.
All right, this is a gimmick, but because we're at the end of the session, you can all hate me for it and then leave. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being there is no chance on God's green earth that a grand bargain will pass in the next couple of years, 10 being it's a sure thing, give me a number, each of you. Senator Kerrey?
2.
7.
There's going to be a bargain, whether it's going to be in the next 2 years. We're going to fix this problem. This is America.
So you're a 10 on a longer time frame.
Well, in the
Well,
long
what's
run,
your number on a
10.
2-year time frame? I want to hold you to the framework.
I think that's completely possible that we will waste 4 years because of the president. Americans
So you're giving it a
voted for
1.
gridlock, they got it.
You're giving it a 1.
Well, in the next, let me say, in the next 2 years,
Okay.
I think probably not.
1 with
I'd say
caveats.
2. I'll be agreeing with that.
Okay, Senator McCain?
A 7. My other favorite Alan Simpson joke, which has nothing to do with our conversation. It's 2 a.m. in Cody, Wyoming. The phone rings. A guy answers the phone and says, "Well, how the hell would I know? It's 1,000 miles away." He hangs up the phone, and his wife said, "Who is that, honey?" He says, "Some guy wanted to know if the coast was clear."
So you're a 7.
7.
I'm a 6.
All right. Well, a more optimistic group than not. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. It's been a real pleasure.